wonderful to be with you. If you haven't been in a previous session, my name is Jake Mulder. I work for Fuller Seminary, which is based in Pasadena, California. I'm in Pasadena, California right now at Fuller, but otherwise I live in Michigan. So home is in Michigan, Fuller is in California. I wear two hats at Fuller. One is as the Senior Director of Strategy for the Fuller Youth Institute. We are a research and training organization that focuses on young people and the church. And that is primarily the context that I am going to speak from today. However, I also wear a hat as the Executive Director of Leadership Formation in the church and think about overall church leadership and those sorts of topics. So glad that you are here for this session on understanding and empowering young people in worship. Understanding and empowering young people in worship. And in this session, we are going to draw on some research that we have done on churches that are growing young. So that's the direction that we are going to go. This is a workshop session, so feel free to chat in questions along the way. And as those questions come in, I am happy to respond to them so that this can be hopefully a little bit more of a back and forth dialogue and not just me sharing information. Let's see. So background on what's going to lead into this. So there are two big studies we've done at the Fuller Youth Institute that will inform this. One is called Sticky Faith. And in Sticky Faith, we studied several hundred churches that are thriving. In Sticky Faith, we studied several hundred teenagers. Sorry, it's getting afternoon here. We studied several hundred teenagers in Sticky Faith to look at what happened to their faith after high school, who stuck with their faith, hence the Sticky Faith. And then we looked at who did not stick with their faith and what were the reasons why. So some of that may come in here. Churches growing young, we studied several hundred churches in the United States to look at who was thriving in their ministry with teenagers and young adults. What were the factors that led them to be effective with the younger generation? And one of the principles that shows up in those churches is that they practice something called Keychain leadership. So all of that is going to come into this study here and this presentation. Let me go ahead and share some slides. These slides should be available for you to download, and we will go ahead and get into it. Okay, so if you were in a previous session, you've already heard me talk about this diagram a bit. We call this the Growing Young Wheel, and it is our summary of the 6 areas of church culture that matter most if you really want to move to more effective ministry with teenagers and young adults. In the upper right-hand corner, this is one we're going to talk about more today, this idea of Keychain leadership. What that means is that we are not centralizing power and authority in our church in the hands of a few, but we are equipping and empowering people, especially young people, with the ability to lead. Working our way clockwise, empathy today. We found that churches that thrive with young people, they step into young people's shoes. They empathize. They don't just get frustrated with where they're coming from. They really embrace young people. They listen to them. They engage with them. Working our way around clockwise, they take Jesus's message seriously. We heard from a number of young people who said, I feel like so many churches I go to are mostly focused on being or doing church, or living out some cultural or political version of Christianity. And we heard from a lot of young people, they want to be part of a church that they feel like takes Jesus's message seriously. Number 4, warm relationships. We found that what young people want as much or more than anything is to be in a church where they belong, a church where they feel known, accepted, and like they're cared for. This would be, 9 o'clock. So on the left side, these churches prioritize young people and their families everywhere. And what we found is a lot of churches say that young people are a priority. Very few actually take the tangible steps that are necessary to truly make young people and their families a priority. And then the last area that stands out is that these churches need to be the best neighbors in their community. We found that churches that young people are engaged by and love are those that are active at serving in their community, connecting with their neighbors. One other recap, what I've covered in some previous sessions, we think that this process of growing young is not primarily about changing youth ministry. It's about changing church culture. And the reason that that matters is often when we think about what needs to happen with young people in the church, we automatically go to the youth ministry and think, well, maybe we should do that differently. And what we found is if we really want to engage a younger generation well, yes, that includes youth ministry, but it's not limited to youth ministry. It's about our overall church culture that we are creating. The reason I think this is relevant for you as a worship leader is as a worship leader, you are as responsible as anyone for setting the culture, direction, and strategy of what the overall church focuses on and does. So I think your voice, your intention in focusing on young people is a critical area in this work. Now, as we get into this concept of keychain leadership, I will say a key piece that stands out from research is that young people who end up leading in the church, not leaving, young people who end up leading in the church, stepping into a position of leadership, those tend to be the same young people who end up sticking with or lasting in the church. I think it makes sense then for us to equip and empower those young people in the church, and there are many ways we can do that through worship. I think that if we will equip and empower young people, that is good for them and their development and them sticking in the church and the faith. I think that's also good for our churches too, that when we equip and empower young people, it helps our churches innovate, learn, grow, etc. The question, sort of really focus in what we're talking about here, the question is, how do we do this well? How do we really equip and empower young people, especially when it comes to worship? Well, to get into that, I'm going to unpack some of the research we've done on this concept of keychain leadership. So let me unpack what that means. In our study of these churches that are thriving, we found that the vast majority of churches, when we asked them, why are you effective with young people? They pointed to leadership, and they would say, leadership is the reason that we are effective with young people. And we said, okay, well, we need to understand, what does that mean? What kind of leadership? Whose leadership? And we found when we were asking about this, there is a major myth out there that what young people want most is a young, hip leader. And that all teenagers and young adults need is that young, hip leader. And if there's a young, hip leader in the church, then young people are going to be drawn to that person in that church. Now, I say that's a myth, and here's a few reasons why. I want to introduce you to some churches in our study. We're not talking about Pastor Kanye, if you know who that is. He was not one of the churches we studied, but on the far right of this photo is Rich Wilkerson Jr. And Rich Wilkerson Jr. is the pastor of a church called VOUS Church, VOUS. He was, before that, at Trinity Church, which is his dad's church, as the young adults director. And when you think about whatever your picture is of a younger, hipper pastor, I would guess that Pastor Rich on the far right falls into that category. He pastored a church that was thriving with younger people. Kim Kardashian and Kanye West apparently at the time were members of his church. So we did find churches that were led by young, hip pastors. Here's another pastor in our study, Peter Ahn. I got to interact with Peter Ahn, and he's on the younger side. I think he's pretty familiar with what's happening in culture. He used cultural references, could connect with young people in his sermons. He was a draw for many young people, but I want to introduce you to two other leaders who aren't quite so young. This is Vanda Bjorklund. Vanda is the volunteer youth pastor at her small rural church in Volga, South Dakota. And Vanda, by her own admission, would say, I am not young, I am not hip, but young people in the church love that church. And in many ways, it was because of Vanda. One other pastor, this is Reverend Jesse Brown in the middle, pastor of First Baptist Church on the south side of Chicago. Another pastor who is not on the younger side, he would say, he doesn't think of himself as all that hip. There is a significant portion, a high number of young people, teenagers and young adults who are engaged in his church. And when we ask them, why do you love this church so much? they didn't point to a younger, hipper person who invested in them. They would point to Reverend Jesse Brown and his consistent investment, his stability, and the way that he has invested in them over the years. Let me introduce you to one last leader. This is Stretch Dean. So his real name is Stephen, but his nickname, as long as he can remember, has been Stretch. And we got to know Stretch because he was the youth leader at Emmanuel Church of the Nazarene. So if we have any Nazarene pastors, leaders on our call today, he is part of your tribe. And when he was at Emmanuel, Emmanuel was very well known for its effectiveness with teenagers and young adults. They were nominated by their denomination for being incredibly effective. And so we decided to visit the church, and we were asking around and asking, okay, why is it that this church is so effective with young people? And people kept pointing to Pastor Stretch. So we thought, okay, we need to get to know Stretch and ask him, why is the church so effective with young people? And he said, well, yeah, I think it's pretty simple. It's about the type of leadership that we have in our church. And we said, well, can you tell us about that leadership and what it is? And he said, sure, but I need to take you back to when I turned 16 years old growing up in Pennsylvania. And he said, when I turned 16 years old, I'd gotten my driver's license and my parents gave me the keys to the family car. And I took the car out for my first drive by myself. I pulled out of my driveway, took a right on the street, was trying to figure out where to drive. And I thought, well, I really love being at church, so maybe I'll drive over to the church. He drove over to the church. He pulled into the parking lot. He noticed that someone he knew well, the child care coordinator, was at the church because the child care had just wrapped up. And the child care coordinator said, hey, Stretch, I noticed you have your driver's license. We're kind of short-staffed here in the child care department. Would you be interested in helping us out after school? Stretch thought about it for a second, and he thought, well, I love being at church. I like hanging out with kids. Somewhere along the way, I think she said they're going to pay me for it. So yeah, that sounds great. I can help out. And she said, okay, I need to go inside and get something. She went inside, she came back, and she put a key in Stretch's hand. And she said, Stretch, this is a key to our church. And Stretch was looking at the key and really said he didn't hear a word that she said after that, because he's thinking, my pastor has this key. My Sunday school teacher has this key. People in my church who have power and authority, they're the ones who have keys like this. But me, Stretch, I'm 16 years old. And she said, Stretch, we know you, we love you, we trust you. We're going to show you how to use this key, because there's times you're going to need to grab things from a closet, somewhere that's locked. We'll show you how to use the key. So life's pretty good for Stretch. He's got a key to the church, and he's got a key to the car. He ends up coming back to help out with the childcare a few days later, and the youth leader from the church comes up to him and says, hey, Stretch, I noticed that, you've got your car now, you're helping out with the childcare. I could really use someone to stock the soda machine at the church. Would you be interested in helping out? And by the way, it comes with all the Mountain Dew that you can drink for free. And Stretch thought, yep, that's easy. For him, the Mountain Dew was almost better than having the cash. So he said, yep, that's an easy yes, I can do that. So again, life's pretty good for Stretch. He's got keys to the church, keys to his car, and keys to the soda machine. Later that night, he ends up at the church playing basketball. And at one point, he was in the gym by himself, and Stretch told us he heard the voice of God speaking to him. Now, Stretch is Nazarene. I'm not sure exactly what the voice of God speaking to him means in a Nazarene context, but you can adjust that to your context. He didn't think it was an audible voice, but he knew God was speaking nonetheless. And of all the things that God could say, God started out by saying, hey, Stretch. And Stretch responded, yeah, God. And God said, you really like being at the church, don't you? And Stretch said, yes, God, I really do. And God said, well, I want you to get comfortable, because you are going to be spending a lot of time here in the future. And what Stretch told us is that was the final quote unquote key that he needed to receive before he was ready to give himself over to a life of leadership and investment in the church. And Stretch went on to tell us that in the years and decades that followed, he had people who came to him, adults who were older, year after year after year, who would give him a key, whether it was literal or a metaphorical key. Sometimes it actually opened a door. Other times it was just an area of power, authority, or responsibility, and who would invest in him and show him how to use that key. We ended up calling that, from all of our data and the terms that Stretch used, this idea of keychain leadership. And when we asked Stretch to reflect on what made such a difference for you in your leadership, he said, look, I had people who came to me year after year after year. They saw the potential in me, even when I didn't see it in myself. And they would hand me a key and they would show me how to use that key. So he said, in our church, look, this is the way that we lead. We are always on the lookout for a younger person who is capable, a younger person who might be able to invest or take something on. And then we hand them a key and we show them how to use that key. We practice keychain leadership in our church. And when we talk to the young people in that church, part of the reason they engaged, part of the reason they invested, part of the reason they love that church is because of the way that the church invested in them as leaders. So what I'm going to do in a second is unpack a few of these concepts and some things that make a difference. I do want to pause and I want to check the chat to see if anything, okay, there's nothing that has come in from the chat. I will pause for just a minute. I'm curious if anybody has questions. I'm curious if anybody has comments on these ideas we've been talking about so far of keychain leadership and how we can understand and empower young people in worship. If anybody has anything to add, please do. And I said add. If anybody has anything to add or if anybody has anything that they would like to ask, please do go ahead and put that in the chat. I'll pause for about 10 more seconds before I continue to present. Okay, not hearing anything yet. I'm going to continue to present and I will pause again in just a few minutes for questions. Okay, so talked about this idea of keychain leadership, and what keychain leadership means is kind of like the idea that it suggests. The longer many of us have been in the church, the more keys that we acquire. Now, keys sometimes can be literal keys. They open doors, things that are locked, but just as often, a key refers to an area of power, authority, or responsibility in the church. And so the concept that we're thinking about, if you often keep your keys on some sort of keychain, the question is, are we willing to actually take a key off of our keychain, hand it to a young person, and show that young person how to use it? Now, in thinking about keychain leadership and specifically trying to apply this to worship and how do we equip and empower young people in worship, we think that there are a few ways that leaders use their keys in the church. One group of leaders we would refer to as keyless leaders. And we say keyless, what we mean by that is that they have not yet received keys. So think of Stretch when he's much younger. He has not been given keys. He does not have access or authority. We also think that there are key hoarding leaders. Now, a key hoarding leader is someone who says, I've gotten this key, I've earned this key, you are not going to get this key from me until you pry it from my cold, dead fingers. You may know some key hoarding leaders, you may be a key hoarding leader yourself. What we're talking about, this other type, is keychain leaders, someone who is aware enough, has the self-confidence that they actually know the key that they hold, that's the awareness part, but that they're confident enough and care enough to take that key off of their keychain and invest it, to share it with someone else. Now, we could name all sorts of other leaders, key loaning leaders who kind of give the key for a short time but take it back, key throwing leaders who throw it at people from a distance and say, sorry, I don't have time to show you. You could come up with your other additions to that. What I find to be a helpful analogy when we think about how we can equip and empower younger people, including in worship, is this idea of driver's ed. Now, if you've ever gone through driver's ed, know a young person who's gone through driver's ed, it's really an iterative process where before young people actually ever get in driver's ed class, they have been in cars with us, watching us drive, and they have learned from that. And I would say today's young people, when it comes to worship and leadership in the church, they have been watching us drive. But before we ever let a young person get behind the wheel of a car, We have them do a little reading and learning and conversation about what it means to drive. After that, we eventually let them get in a vehicle, but we do not put them out on the highway. We put them in an enclosed environment, a safe environment. It's normally a parking lot, a very large parking lot, where they have the opportunity to drive slowly and make their mistakes in a protected environment and atmosphere. Even the first time that young people tend to take a car out on the road as part of driver's training, they normally have a professional who's sitting next to them. And in the seat next to them, those cars often have a brake that is put in so that we can help young people stop from getting into some sort of accident. The principle that applies here when we think about equipping and empowering young people in the church is there really needs to be a mentoring role that we take on, a guiding role, kind of a let us as the adult do it while you as a young person watch. And then let's go ahead and move to the point where we're doing it together. Then let's move to the point where you as a young person are doing it and I am watching you and mentoring and guiding you along the way. And then we move to a point where a young person is doing it completely on their own. Now, often I will talk with churches who say, we really want to empower young people in worship and we're excited about it. So they go find the first young person they can find in the church and let them publicly read scripture or preach or sing a song, and it doesn't go well. And then they say, we're never going to do that again. I would say that is very much like if you know a young person who's never driven a vehicle before, and you hand them the keys and say, hey, best way to learn is to take it out on the highway. Go ahead. That's probably not going to go well for that young person. But I think sometimes that's the way we treat leadership in the church, is kind of expect young people to go 0 to 60 overnight, instead of actually mentoring, investing, and guiding them in what they need to do. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing screen again. I want to go back and see, okay, Mark Green. Mark, you said my home church empowered me to be the volunteer church pianist beginning in the 5th grade. I have just turned 60. I've been playing in the church from the 5th grade until now. The church was patient with me, encouraging me and affirming me all along the way. Mark, I think that is an incredible example. Your own testimony of Keychain leadership, right? Someone who invested in you. And I think the question is, how are we going to invest and empower a younger generation in the same way? I would love to invite you, whether you want to chat in an example of how someone entrusted and empowered you in the past, or you want to chat in a question, either one of those, would love for you to chat in. Lily, your question, if there's different opinions among adult leaders towards a young person, some think it's okay to pass the key to him or her, but some don't. How can this be resolved? Lily, I think that is a great question. I'll give a couple of different answers. One is, I think that this is an area where real leadership is necessary. And I think that if you are someone who plans worship in your church, if you're one who supervises volunteers, simply beginning this conversation and helping have a dialogue about how we entrust and empower younger people is one way to go. The other thing that I would say, Lily, is there's great opportunities to start small. Okay, there's great opportunities to start small. And I want you to imagine, everyone to imagine, let's say for driver's ed, let's say that we didn't put young people in like a safe parking lot the very first time they drove, but we went to, we took a football stadium. I know Texas has big football stadiums, so maybe you can picture a football stadium. Or let's even go with a racetrack. Let's say the very first time young people learn how to drive, we go to a racetrack, we put all of them in a race car with all this horsepower and everything. And again, keep in mind, they've never learned how to drive. We fill the stands with all their friends and family, and everyone is watching them. And then we say, okay, drive. Sometimes I think that's what we do with young people when we put them in very public leadership positions without any training. I am a huge advocate of giving young people safe, comfortable spaces where they can fail and make their mistakes. So part of that is, let's say that your church really values excellence in worship. it may be a dangerous thing for your church and for the young person to put them up in front of everybody without that experience and training. I would wonder, are there smaller venues, places within your church? Maybe it's within the children's ministry or the youth ministry or some other activity, a special worship night that you put on where you can give those young people the opportunity to lead, and you let them develop those basic competencies. So when they really get into an adult service, they're ready for that. So Lily, those would be a couple of ideas. I'm going to go ahead and share a few more slides, and then we will take the rest of our time for discussion here. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about driver's training. Here are a few other bits of advice, tips, that sort of thing. One idea is simply to identify who's ready for keys. And I don't want to overcomplicate this. I really want to keep it simple. I don't think you need to empower all young people in your church equally at the same time. I would encourage you to be intentional and think about, is there one or two or three young people who in our church are ready to begin to take on that leadership, and to look for them, mentor them up, and train them. That would be one way forward. The second area that I want to emphasize is the importance of empathy. That as we are raising young people up, as we are inviting them to lead, we need to be willing to step into their shoes and understand where they're coming from. Now, what that means is, are there terms we're going to use? Are there things we're going to expect them to know that they might not yet have been exposed to? We need to understand how to feel with them, to sit on the curb with them, to move past judgment and frustration when they don't understand, and truly have this desire to equip them, but ability to understand their world enough to know what they are going to need as we move forward. Another idea that I would offer along with this is part of leadership, I think, is vulnerability in creating the environment where young people can really thrive and make mistakes. So I would say when it comes to vulnerability, be willing to go first. We've studied and interacted with a number of churches where young people said, part of the reason I step into leadership, part of the reason I'm involved here is the leaders who are in charge, they're actually vulnerable. They're actually willing to admit their own mistakes and give me the opportunity to make mistakes, as opposed to expecting young people to be perfect, have everything together, and never struggle when it comes to leadership. Now, when it comes to vulnerability, and when it comes to empathy, I do want to share just a little bit of background on today's young people and where they're coming from. The reality for today's young adults is they tend to be growing up, and when I say growing up, they tend to be making life's major decisions about 5 years later than previous generations. So in a previous generation, you were married, likely had kids, and in your long-term job when you are, say, age 22 or 23. Those markers are happening more like age 28 or 29 for young adults today. We would say that today's young adults also have more options of what school they want to go to, what they want to be when they grow up, what cereal to eat for breakfast than in previous generations. We would also say that today's younger people have less relational support than in previous generations, that they don't have the investment and the support. Now, they might have people who pay for things, who give them opportunities, who send them to camps, that sort of thing, but not the truly engaged at a deep level kind of conversational connection, relational support that some previous generations have had. And what that results in is this idea that 28 is the new 18, that some of the markers that 18-year-olds had hit in previous generations, today's young people are hitting those closer to age 28. Now, you might say, well, that must mean that today's young people, they're just lazy, they're not developing, they need to work harder. It's not quite so simple, and I want to demonstrate that with this diagram. This is a picture, painting with a very broad brush, but this is a picture of what it looked like to become an adult in the US in a previous generation. So you were born at some point along the way, you went to high school. After high school, you might have gone to college, but eventually you get a job. After getting a job, you get married. After getting married, you have kids. Now, it didn't look that way for everyone, but just painting with a broad brush, There was an order and flow with which we thought society was supposed to function. Churches were very much built for this sort of stage progression world. The challenge is this is not the world today's young people are interacting with. The world today's young people are growing up in looks much more like this. There are twists, there are turns, it is complex, it is confusing, it is not linear. Let me show you that one more time. This is the world as it was. If you are consider yourself an adult or a senior adult, you probably grew up in this world. This is the world that today's young people are experiencing, and it is a very different world. If we can resonate and understand this concept, we find it helps to have a lot more empathy for today's young people. A few more ideas that I will wrap up with, and then we'll take the rest of the time for discussion. One is to empower young leaders to envision new doors with new keys. Part of what that means is if we're going to invite young people into leadership, they might have a different idea for how we might want to do something. And the question is, are we willing to take their ideas seriously? Are we willing to innovate, to respond, to consider new possibilities of what might be? While that doesn't work well in stable times where we want to maintain what has always been, this works incredibly well in times that we're in, like COVID and all of the other challenges that are happening now where we need to innovate. Often young people are our best innovators and can lead the way forward for where to go. The challenge can be, if we don't want things to change, bringing young people in may mean no more business as usual. They may force change, want to see change, and that is part of our job as a leader to manage. The last point I want to make is if we're going to invite young people into leadership, young people need to play a load-bearing role. And if you are thinking about bringing a young person into your worship team, equipping and empowering them, I want to encourage you to invite young people to play a load-bearing role. Now, load-bearing comes from the idea in construction, there are some walls and beams and posts that actually hold up a structure. And then there's some walls that are just decorative. In your church, if you have one of those accordion sorts of walls that can fold up, that separate Sunday school rooms, that is not a load-bearing wall. It's non-load-bearing, because if you take that wall away, the whole structure still will hold up. We talk to a lot of teenagers and young adults in their church who they are not playing a load-bearing role. They're decorative, they're filling space, but they could go away and the church would continue to function just fine. I would invite you to consider how young people might play a load-bearing role. Many of our churches, we end up just using young people as cheap labor. You know you're using young people as cheap labor if there's something that needs to be done and no one wants to do it, and you say, well, maybe we can get the young people to do it, right? Stacking chairs in the nursery, that sort of thing. We need to make sure on our teams we are not just using young people as cheap labor. So that is just a little bit on this idea of keychain leadership, on the ways that we can equip and empower young people, specifically when it comes to thinking about worship. Now, you've probably noticed worship leading is not my primary context. So what I'd love to do now is talk about how this might apply in your contexts. Would love if you want to add questions, if you want to add ideas of what has worked well in your church, go ahead and add those to the chat. And then I am happy to take some time to interact with those, answer questions as they may come up. So please do go ahead and add those. And I'll give it 10 or 20 seconds, depending on how many there are. I do have one story about this that I'd like to tell, but would rather hear your questions, thoughts, and ideas before I offer some of those. And I'm I'll specifically say Mark because you were someone who was given the keys, and you're still holding the keys in some ways, because I think you said you're leading. If you have any ideas about what does it mean in your church to equip and empower or give young people the keys, would be very interested to hear that as well. But please do, anyone, if you have questions, go ahead and add those and we can interact with the questions. All right, I'm going to tell my story, and then hopefully a couple questions come in while I'm telling my story and we can interact around those. Otherwise, we will end a little early and give you a break before you go to your next session. So I'm going to tell a story about a Lutheran church. This is Christ the King Lutheran Church, which is located in North Carolina. And again, this is an ELCA congregation, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. This is a church that very much decided to practice Keychain leadership. So they were involved in one of our Growing Young trainings. And as a result, they said, okay, we really want to have young people involved in leadership and worship of our church. So we want to figure out how to do that. And the first thing that we invited them to do was to spend time listening to the young people, not just to tell the young people what they needed in the church, but to connect with the young people and ask them, how do you want to be involved? What does it look like for you to be involved? And so they took that feedback, they implemented it into some of their decision-making. One of the things that the young people said was, there are never any young people on the stage in our church, and we really want to have some young people who are incorporated in leading worship. And so they began to rotate some younger voices into reading scripture, being part of the choirs, that sort of thing. Now, this was a fairly traditional church, so they ended up meeting a fair amount of resistance from people who did not love that young people were being incorporated into worship. And so the youth leader who was driving this discussion and was on the same page, the youth leader doubled as the worship leader. So the worship leader and the youth leader were on the same page, because in this case, they were the exact same person. Well, there was some resistance, and come to find out, it wasn't that the majority of the church was resistant to this. It was a very vocal minority. And my guess is you have experience with the very vocal minority, who they speak loudly, they speak often, even if they do not speak for the majority of the church. And the youth leader, worship leader ended up realizing they couldn't deal with this issue alone. So they went to the senior pastor of the church and said, look, we've made a decision as a church. We want to invest in and prioritize young people. I'm getting a lot of resistance of young people even being involved in anything happening on the platform. And they were not trying to radically change the worship style. This was pretty small potatoes when it came to changes in worship, of just having some young people visible. Well, in this case, the senior pastor agreed and said, we are going to be a church that exists for young people and equips them, not exclusively young people, but young people will be a core part of the church. And so the senior pastor did end up having a conversation with a few people about young people being in leadership. And I'm not saying this is the right way for you to do it, but the senior pastor basically gave these people an option who were resistant and said, look, I'm not going to let the teenagers and young adults in the church bear the brunt of your frustrations. This is a conversation for us as leaders in the church to have, and you have a choice. In this case, you can either be okay with young people being on the platform, or you can find another church to worship in. Now, that was how that senior pastor chose to approach it. I'm not giving that as your advice, but it's what they decided to do. Some of the resistance in the church moved along, and the rest of the church was very happy with the direction that things were going. The church began to ask a very regular question of just how and where might young people be involved in leadership. They asked this question for several months, even a year, and there were not many areas where they saw young people stepping into leadership. But they started asking this about a year before COVID. And what ended up happening is when COVID hit, they had to figure out how to take their services online. They had to think about who is most comfortable in our church actually showing up and being in a physical space, now wearing masks and all the different principles that the church wanted to engage in that case. And what they ended up seeing was that young people were very comfortable with digital technology. They were very comfortable with being on camera. Young people were very comfortable helping lead the church in this setting. So during COVID, young people were primed and ready because the church had been asking how and where might they be involved. They were primed and ready to step into leadership. So what ended up happening is many of the creative ideas for how to lead worship came from the younger people. A lot of the technology for the church to engage in live stream and Facebook Live and Zoom ended up coming from the young people. It was to the point that I ended up talking to pastors from this church about 6 months into the COVID pandemic and said, oh man, you must really be having a hard time. And they said, it's actually the opposite. I'm not sure our church has ever had so much life, energy, and vitality because they had spent time preparing and laying the foundation for young people to step up and lead. The young people had come in during that season and really helped the church adapt. The young people went so far as there were senior adults who were struggling to engage with the live stream. There were senior adults who didn't know how to engage. And early in the pandemic, these young people ended up connecting with those senior adults and showed them how to set up the technology and engage. It was this beautiful story of the church thought that they were taking steps that would benefit the young people. And the young people ended up coming back and taking a whole set of responsibility and leadership that ended up benefiting the church. Young people ended up taking on things like the soundboard and other technology to really keep things top notch as the church could not meet in person. Now, fast forward to today, young people really are integrated as those who sing in the church. Keep in mind, it is not the young people show. It's not like the church flipped a switch and said, now we are only a church for young people. They did not change every aspect of what they're doing. Many of the hymns and worship style is still the same, but young people feel like they have a voice. They are visible. They are noticed. They see their peers on stage, and they are inviting the church into all sorts of wonderful ways to move forward. This is that idea where the church has embraced a series of changes in their culture, right? It's not just changes in youth ministry. It's been changes in their culture where they are actually seeing benefit for everyone the whole way around. So there's one story of what this can look like when a church is choosing to empower young people well. I do see a question that's come in. I will answer this question, and I would love if others have questions. If there are no other questions, we will probably conclude with a question here. So if you have one, would love for you to chat it in. The question is, we've had the opportunity to have several students lead, playing piano for student choir, helping lead worship, etc. Thankfully, our church loves seeing young people in leadership. However, there are some who will make comments about what they are wearing or if they raise their hands. How can we effectively communicate the importance of student leadership over the particular stumbling blocks some see? That is a wonderful question, and I'm glad to hear that, yes, you've got a good portion of your church that loves seeing young people in leadership. The challenge is that often young people may look, dress, or do something differently than the way that we did it, right? So part of the question is, how do we bring others along? I'm going to go back to two principles. One is empathy, and I do think many of our churches, we need empathy training. And I'm not just saying this about young people. I think this is the case for so many areas where we're experiencing division because we as a church really don't understand unity. We don't understand how to step into other people's shoes. I think one great way to solve that can be a sermon series. And it can be a sermon series on empathy, connection, stepping into someone else's world and understanding where they're coming from. Now, if you're wondering, is there a biblical basis for that? I would say it's this little thing called the incarnation, about how God went from God's world, stepped in, became like one of us. I think the Apostle Paul and others do a whole lot of writing, and I think Jesus embodies the sense of empathy, connection, and understanding. So that's just one piece Many of us are used to being in our own world, and we need to be trained in how to step into someone else's world. The other piece that I would add here is really just the importance of vision and the importance of helping people understand what we're trying to do. And I think as Christians and as churches, we have something incredible and wonderful where we can step up and lead and show people what a different future can look like. I think often we make changes in the church without telling anyone why we're making those changes. So let me get really practical here. I think you can take a moment at the beginning of worship or somewhere during worship and just address this head on and say, look, you may notice we've got some voices here who have not been involved in leading before. The reason we have younger people involved is because of X, Y, Z. And we value this as a church, and this is what we're hoping for, and we want to see them develop and go into other places. Often if we can give young people, if we can give all people in the church a picture of why we're doing what we're doing and a vision for what this might look like, they are more likely to come along. So those would be just a couple thoughts. Mark, you said your church is providing a summer music internship for a student who grew up in our church, just graduated from college. You're mentoring him one-on-one. He led worship for the first time last Sunday while I was away and did a great job. Mark, I love, it just feels like you're bookending this whole talk because you started with the idea that you were given keys and empowered in the 5th grade. You've now been doing that for whatever that is, about 50 years. And now here you are mentoring a student, a younger you, to step up in leadership. I just think, Mark, you're hitting the nail on the head for how is it that we equip and empower young people. It's with the relational care, investment, attention. I love that. If there's any last question, would love to go ahead and take that. And then if there are no questions, I think we will go ahead and wrap up. So I'll hold on for just a second. All right, I am not hearing anything. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for the opportunity to engage in this topic and think about how we equip and empower younger leaders in the church. And wish you all the best as you go throughout the rest of the conference and step into next stages of leadership within your church. Thanks.